The cliffs of Saipan were never meant to echo with screams. But in July 1944, American soldiers stood frozen as whole Japanese families stepped towards the island's rocky edges. Some clung to one another, some prayed, many just wept. And then, one after another, they jumped. For many civilians, it was the final order that they would ever receive. Japanese soldiers had told them that the Americans would torture them. Propaganda had shown the Americans as demons with claws and fangs. Surrender was described as worse than death. 5-year-old Kuyu Shiroma remembered his father's desperate warning, "The Americans will kill you. You must die yourself." Moments later, Kuyu followed the crowd and leapt, but survived because his clothing snagged on a branch. This horror wasn't an isolated incident. Similar scenes unfolded on Tinian, on Saipan, and later on a massive scale at Okinawa, and behind all of it was the same driving force: fear. Fear built over years of propaganda, fear hardened by battlefield experience, and fear fueled by a realization that the enemy Japan once mocked might in fact be unstoppable. So here's the question directly: did the Japanese truly fear the Americans during World War II? Long before Pearl Harbor, Japanese perceptions of the Americans were shaped by resentment and cultural friction. The United States had imposed severe economic sanctions in response to Japan's wars in China and its expansion into French Indochina. These embargoes, especially on oil, threatened Japan's entire war machine. To many Japanese citizens, this American position looked deliberately hostile and humiliating. Propaganda reinforced this. Americans were portrayed as weak, individualistic, and lacking any form of Bushido, the warrior spirit that Japanese ideology prized above all else. The West was decadent, lazy, and spiritually empty. Technically advanced, sure, but fundamentally soft. To a society steeped in martial culture, this distinction mattered. Japan believed its collective discipline and willingness to sacrifice would triumph over America's material abundance. In short, before the war, many Japanese looked down on the Americans. They didn't fear them. Once war broke out, Japanese units gained first-hand experience fighting Americans in places like Guadalcanal, the Philippines, and the Solomon Islands. Their reports reveal a complex picture. On one hand, American infantrymen were noted to be skilled riflemen, capable grenade users, and usually supported by extraordinary artillery fire. The Japanese were struck by how quickly American forces adapted, how well they used combined arms, and how effectively they leveraged their industrial might. But the early assessments still echoed pre-war arrogance. Japanese officers wrote that the Americans lacked initiative, scouted poorly, and were overly dependent on firepower. Supply dumps were described as extravagant, which reinforced the belief that Americans were spoiled and soft. At this stage, the Japanese saw their enemy as capable, but still inferior in spirit. That perception wouldn't last. By late 1943, something changed. Despite heavy casualties, American forces kept pushing forward. The U.S. Navy replaced sunk ships at staggering speed. Lost aircraft were replaced in greater numbers. Infantry divisions rotated fresh troops into battle, while Japan's ranks grew thinner and younger. For Japanese soldiers, this was unnerving. The American industrial base, immense, distant, and untouchable, was an enemy of its own. Diaries and interrogations reveal comments like, "They never stopped coming. Their ships returned faster than we can sink them. It's like fighting the tide." This was the beginning of genuine fear, not of American courage, but of American inevitability. As the Pacific Campaign intensified, one group in particular came to symbolize American ferocity: the U.S. Marine Corps. From Guadalcanal onward, Marines earned a reputation as relentless assault troops. Japanese propaganda amplified this reputation, portraying Marines as inhuman barbarians, murderers, sadists, and even criminals recruited from prisons. Absurd rumors circulated claiming Marines were forced to kill their own families to prove their loyalty. Wild, yeah, but effective. Many Japanese soldiers came to believe that to surrender to the Marines was equivalent to torture or execution. Civilians absorbed this belief too, setting the stage for the mass suicides that would shock American troops in 1944 and 45. By the time the American forces had reached Saipan, fear among the Japanese population had hit its peak. After brutal fighting and a final desperate banzai charge, Japanese defenders were shattered. The civilians, conditioned for years to believe that the Americans were monsters, now faced what they believed was their fate. Hundreds, possibly over 1,000, chose suicide. Journal entries from American soldiers described the scenes in disbelief. Entire families walking calmly to the edge, bowing towards the sea, and jumping hand in hand. U.S. troops tried to shout assurances, even posted Japanese-speaking interpreters, but to little effect. Fear had replaced reason. Of Saipan's roughly 20,000 civilians, as many as 13,000 died during the battle, though exact numbers are difficult to verify. This tragedy made one thing undeniable: Japan's wartime propaganda had succeeded far too well. Several factors reinforced Japanese terror as the war continued. One were feigned surrenders and brutal close-quarters fighting. Japanese soldiers often pretended to surrender before detonating grenades or using knives at point-blank range. U.S. medics, often moving unarmed to treat wounded men, were killed this way. American troops learned to not trust surrender gestures, which led to legitimate surrenders sometimes being met with preemptive gunfire. To Japanese observers, this looked like proof of American savagery. 2. The trophy-taking. While not widespread, the taking of skulls, teeth, and ears by some American servicemen horrified both the Japanese and the American High Command, which eventually issued strict prohibitions. Japanese civilians and soldiers often heard rumors, some true, most exaggerated, that Americans collected body parts as trophies. Given the climate of mutual dehumanization, these stories spread rapidly once the media and newspapers got a hold of them. They became yet another reason surrender seemed impossible. 3 was the American firepower. Perhaps nothing provoked more dread than American artillery and naval bombardment. Japanese diaries frequently mentioned the earth-shaking power of American naval guns, nighttime bombardments that made sleep impossible, and shells that fell endlessly. To soldiers that were raised to believe in spirit over machinery, this display of overwhelming industrial power was psychologically crushing. By 1945, the Pacific War had become a feedback loop of terror. Japan taught its people that Americans were monsters. Japanese soldiers acted in ways that hardened Americans into distrust. American responses confirmed Japanese fears, which in turn justified more resistance and more brutality. Neither side saw the other as fully human anymore. Okinawa, just 340 miles from mainland Japan, was the last and bloodiest battle of the Pacific. Between 150,000 civilians died, many caught between the two armies. Many more pressed into forced labor, and thousands encouraged or coerced to commit suicide rather than surrender. When U.S. planners studied Okinawa's casualty rates, they concluded that an invasion of Japan itself might kill millions, both Allied and Japanese. The Japanese government, meanwhile, broadcast increasingly desperate propaganda, urging civilians to resist to the death, warning again that Americans would commit atrocities against anyone who surrendered. Fear had consumed the home islands. And yet, when American forces finally occupied Japan after its surrender, many civilians were shocked to be treated with professionalism and restraint, proof that wartime propaganda had shaped a distorted image. On both sides, did the Japanese fear the Americans? The answer is unquestionably yes, but not in a simple way. At the start of the war, the Japanese mocked Americans as soft and undisciplined. On the battlefield, they came to respect American firepower and adaptability. As defeat became inevitable, that respect turned to fear of American strength, of American brutality, and of propaganda-fed nightmares that convinced thousands that death was preferable to capture. In the end, fear shaped how the Pacific War was fought, how civilians behaved, and how millions understood their enemy. It magnified brutality, fueled resolve, and contributed to tragedies that still haunt the memory of the war today.